Okay, so in this video, we are going to take a look at the Puritans, that first voice that we're establishing our American identity with. So what are we looking at? We're going to be looking at their belief system. We're going to also look at the characteristics that show up in their writing. So our goal is to be able to trace thematically their belief system throughout their different literary works, and also to trace different characteristics that make something kind of definitively puritanical in terms of how it's written. So please take some solid notes, and we're going to get ready to apply what we learned today in this video to a piece of Puritan writing at the end. Let's get going.
So as I mentioned, this is an introduction and a little bit of background information on Puritan literature. And this is a great, beautiful picture that I did not take, that I stole from someone on Flickr with way more photography skills than I do, of the Plymouth Plantation. So this was where the Pilgrims lived, and it's now a living museum. So if you ever get to Massachusetts, you can go check it out. It's pretty cool. People talk in British accents and stay in character and act like they don't know what cell phones are. So something for you to try out sometime. Okay, let's get going. All right, so let's set up our notes. Essential questions for today are: why study Puritan literature, and how are Puritan values manifested in their writings? So aside from not being allowed to drink coffee in class, which, I guess I kind of understand. I guess there wasn't Starbucks back then, or probably a big fat dependency on caffeine. Their values are very important. So we're going to learn a bit about those, and by the end of this lesson, you should be able to describe the major beliefs and values of Puritanism and define and identify something called the Puritan Plain Style. And then also you should be able to identify elements of puritanical beliefs in the Puritan Plain Style in representative writing. Okay, so by the end of this lesson, you should have annotated all the relevant information that you need in order to complete these objectives. So let's keep in mind the big picture, where we're going. By the end of the unit, you should be able to write about this. So this idea that literature often reveals a great deal about the attitudes and beliefs of different cultures. So again, specifically with the Puritans, how does the literature of the Puritans reveal their attitudes and values? Now let's just activate a little bit of our prior knowledge here. So in our quest to establish a definition of an American voice, why do we start with the Puritans? So this is from our last lesson. Remember, this is a new voice distinct from the British crown. They're separating from England, and in the case of the Pilgrims, the Church of England. And then physically, ideologically, religiously, it's a new voice. And then also let's remember that the voices of the Native American people and African Americans typically get lost in the process of establishing our identity in terms of a literature in America. For our purposes, we will be reading The Scarlet Letter by Nathaniel Hawthorne, which is set in Puritan New England. It's actually written way after the Puritan period, but it's really important to understand how the Puritans rolled in order to understand what Hawthorne was writing about, the setting, but also essentially what he's railing against in his book as well. There are so many allusions throughout literature and just pop culture, just all sorts of things where people will refer to Puritans and what they believed, or how Puritans would act in a certain situation. So it's just part of being literate and knowledgeable. And then also a big one is understanding the religious foundations of our country. So we're going to focus on 5 writers specifically in the Puritan period. Then that's Anne Bradstreet, William Bradford, Jonathan Edwards, Cotton Mather's got this awesome hair, and Edward Taylor. Now, poor Edward Taylor, he just doesn't even have a picture. So the one that you Google and that you see online isn't really him. So not a lot of fiction, especially with the Puritans. We'll unpack that later as well. Okay, just a little note. I'm gonna explain here. There is a difference between the Pilgrims and Puritans. Here's a little bit of a brain twister for you. Okay, so all Pilgrims are Puritan, but not all Puritans are Pilgrims. So let me put it this way. Basically, the Pilgrims would fall under a Puritan umbrella, but the Puritans were not separatists the way that the Pilgrims were. And so this is a picture of William Bradford and the Pilgrims, chilling on the Mayflower, writing this Mayflower Compact, which is one of the very first examples of early American literature. So I love this picture of the Pilgrims landing in Massachusetts. It's snowy. They're going to be cold. I lived in Boston for 10 years, and the winters, we would have 3 feet of snow in May sometimes. So, it's a toughie. And then also the Pilgrim community was eventually incorporated into the Massachusetts Bay Colony. So their little experiment didn't really even stand on their own. Okay, and then if you're interested in just really solidifying your understanding about the difference between a Pilgrim and a Puritan, here's a handy-dandy Venn diagram to help you with that. Okay, so let's get into the religious beliefs of the Puritans. So Puritanism is a result of the Protestant Reformation. So, Martin Luther gets the ball rolling, and then you have people like John Calvin who agree with separating from the Church of Rome, coming in with kind of their own theological ideas. And he's famous for this one called predestination. So aside from this idea of original sin that they really believe in terms of everyone's born a sinner, because of Adam and Eve, we fell from grace, so we have this original sin on us. But another one that's a big deal is this idea of predestination. So predestination means that there's just kind of a select group of people who were predetermined by God for salvation, to be with God in the afterlife. So another thing that the Puritans weren't super jazzed about was how, in the wake of the Protestant Reformation, the Anglican Church just wasn't holy enough. To the Puritans, the Anglican Church was still too Catholic. So two more things that are going to drive the way the Puritans roll is this intense devotion to God and an intense fear of the devil. Speaking of that fear of the devil and evil in general, this will create a sense of paranoia and fear in the community. So something to remember is when you have an intense fear of something, then that is going to inform how your community governs, how your community treats each other, and how your community worships. The Puritans did not believe in slavery, but they did believe in a racial or religious superiority. So they did see themselves as more superior to certain others and other groups. Okay, so let's take a look at the Puritan value in education. So Puritans were highly literate. Okay, so they were well educated, both men and women, and they established a printing press in the colonies in 1638. So as the first, they're responsible for getting the first printing press rolling here. They created America's first schools. Harvard College originally was founded to ensure a well-educated ministry, and as you can see from my picture over here on the right, Harvard's not so puritanical anymore. I can tell you that. And then they also established public schools in Massachusetts to combat the influence, and I'm quoting one of their charters here, "Ye old deluder Satan." More on Satan later. So continuing with this idea of education, an example of how they helped children learn was the New England Primer that they created in 1690, which offered instructions for children in spelling and reading based in moralistic teachings. So one of the little rhymes they had is like, "In Adam's fall, we sinned all." And this picture is actually from like a children's like textbook of sorts. So Puritan leaders constructed a quasi-republic based upon godly, that is, converted leadership, so converted to God, converted to Jesus. Only the godly could vote, a system which ensured that piety, not property, would determine who elected the leaders of Massachusetts. Once in power, New England leaders passed laws that urged very high standards of biblical morality. So moving on to the actual written works of the Puritans. By today's standards, most of what the Puritans cranked out in terms of literature wouldn't really be considered like, ooh, awesome high literature. But we have some written works that we're going to study that make the mark and make it worthy of our time and definitely offer us an insight into their lives. But the goal of written works for the Puritans should be simply to honor and glorify God. So think AMDG, offer the greater glory of God, no matter what I'm doing. So if you were keeping a journal or a diary, this was supposed to be for a place to keep your serious self-examination and spiritual work. So instead of, "Dear diary, I've got a crush on Bobby, I wonder if he likes me back," it's more like, "Dear diary, dear Lord Jesus, I am striving for thee, and I hope that my, clean heart is appealing to thee," or, So it definitely was not how we see diaries today. So the Bible was the biggest influence on Puritan writing. It offered a model for them. So remember, each individual life was a journey to salvation. So they are trying to write in a way that is manifesting that they are on that journey. They also saw a direct connection between biblical events in their own lives, so they rely heavily on biblical allusion to illustrate and make their points. And it's not just the Puritans. People do this all throughout the history of literature. Post-Christianity, or actually post-Old Testament. But for the Puritans, their audience would be so familiar. So it's not like they would, throw out a reference to the book of Job or Ecclesiastes, and people would be sitting there scratching their heads going, dude, what are they talking about? They'd be like, oh yeah, Job. Oh yeah, that's from Ecclesiastes. So they would have been very, very literate in terms of their biblical knowledge. So a few final things about the characteristics of Puritan writing. It's almost always in the first person narrative point of view. The writings come in the form of diaries, histories, sermons, and essays relating, like I said before, to personal experiences. And writing was for religious reasons, not entertainment. So if you're someone reading a piece of Puritan literature, you should specifically be looking for a message about the importance of God in everyday life. So things like poetry, not super common, but the poetry we do have and that we are going to study is emblematic of Puritan values and beliefs. So remember, writing for the Puritans was a vessel to help them explore their inner and outer lives for the signs of the workings of God in their everyday life. They also wrote in a plain style similar to that of the Geneva Bible. And so what the deal with the plain style is, and I'm actually going to get into this a little bit more on the next slide, is that plain style stresses clear expressions over complicated figures of speech. So let's take a look at what that might look like. So the Puritan plain style is straightforward, not embellished language. So your creative writing teacher would probably be like, oh my gosh, the plain style is killing me. I want more pretty imagery. But the funny thing for us in our modern day sensibilities is that when we're looking at something written in 1606, they're using thee and thou, and we're just like, holy cow, as modern day readers going, this sounds pretty fancy to me. But we have to remember that to them, almost 400 years ago or 400 years ago, it was not fancy. It was just how they talked. They're going to write with clear expressions. They're going to prefer to use a clear expression over writing a complicated metaphor or something super flowery to describe something. So I put the images of these two chairs here to kind of give us an idea, a visual idea of the Puritan plain style. So a Puritan would choose the chair on the left to sit in, and actually that's an example of one they actually weaved at the Plymouth Plantation in Massachusetts. So the idea is choose something that is simple and humble over something ornate and fancy because, that's putting too much stock in a worldly possession. Speaking of, though, this fancy chair looks pretty darn comfortable, though. Ooh, yikes. Okay, please pray for me. I apparently sat in Satan's chair. That's not good. So our objectives today were to describe the major beliefs and values of Puritanism, and to define and identify the Puritan plain style. And then the next objective is to identify elements of puritanical beliefs and the Puritan plain style in a piece of representative writing. Okay, so let's apply what we've learned. Think about what you need for active reading to be successful. Copy of the text in front of you, a pen, pencil, iPencil, depending on how you're going to annotate, quiet space with no distractions, your phone's off, your iPad doesn't have your notifications on, your brain's ready to go with all this recent information ready to apply, and then you're going to be open to growth and annotating your thoughts. We're going to use Anne Bradstreet's poem, Upon the Burning of Our House, July 10th, 1666, and we're going to apply the concepts in this lesson. So the idea here is to identify lines that reflect Puritan themes and values, and then find examples in her diction, so her word choice, of using the plain style, and also see if you can find where she deviates or actually takes a step away from the Puritan plain style. And her writing explores religion and her personal relationship with God. She, like other Puritan women, believed that men were superior to them, and she also felt it improper for a woman to appear in print, which is funny because her brother-in-law actually took a bunch of her poems and published a whole collection of her poems back in England. So it's kind of funny because even though she believed that a woman shouldn't really appear in print, she's actually considered the first American poet. So I think that's kind of a nice little piece of I don't know if it's irony or just kind of oh, look what happened. But she also veers from the Puritan plain style in her poetry by using metaphors and especially extended metaphors. So look for those. Okay, so the directions for our critical reading activity for today is to please read the poem all at once just to get a feeling for it, just to get an idea of what it's about. While you're doing that, circle and look up unfamiliar words. I think there'll be quite a few because, we're going back 400 years and English has changed a lot in the past 400 years. And then read the poem one more time with pen and pencil and then activate your critical reading strategies. Let's get going.